Hello, my name is Solar Simone and welcome to my channel Solar Simone Astrology, where I look at the intersection of pop culture and traditional astrology. Today we're going to be talking about the 3 different decans of Gemini, featuring 3 different movies about twins. So let's get into it. Now, what is a decan? A decan is basically the division of the zodiac signs by 10 degrees. So each zodiac sign has 30 degrees, and when you divide that by 3, that turns into 10-degree sections equaling 3 different decans. Now, in this video, the sources that I'm going to be using include Austin Coppock's 36 Faces, T. Susan Chang's blog posts about the decans, as well as the Fixed Sign Astrology podcast. Alright, before I get into the 3 different decans of Gemini and explaining what they mean, let's just talk about Gemini as an archetype. So Gemini is a mutable sign, which is also known as a double-bodied sign, since Gemini is associated with the twins. So Gemini is very much associated with dualities, splitting, choices, decisions, all of that. Now, Gemini is traditionally ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is the planet of commerce, the planet of communication, the planet of travel, the planet of swiftness. Mercury is the only planet, or associated with the god of Hermes, that can travel between all 3 worlds, the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. So that kind of duality of Mercury, or the ability of Mercury to kind of be everything, everywhere, all at once, very much encapsulates the energy of Gemini and the other sign that Mercury rules, which is Virgo. Now, the energy of Gemini, obviously has a bad rep sometimes in popular culture. Sometimes people think that Gemini suns tend to be two-faced or tend to be manipulative or shapeshifters. Now, Gemini is an air sign, so that means that Gemini is very social, which means that they are very good at talking to different people and encountering new places. I feel like Gemini is very much that never met a stranger. I could say that about all the air signs, but especially Gemini. Gemini has the ability to chat with others like no other. Even if they may be a little bit more shy or have other qualities that make them not as social, Gemini very much has the ability to turn it on like a light switch, which is really nice about them. Other benefits of Gemini is that it's since it has a lot of, mercurial energy and it is Mercury's favorite sign, Gemini tends to be very good at learning things and taking in new information. A lot of people with Gemini placements tend to be very quick learners, tend to be quick on their feet, tend to grasp new skills and information easily. They tend to be like those trivia whizzes where you're kind of like, how did you know that? And it's because they watched that one episode of Jeopardy 10 years ago. That's very much the energy of Gemini. Now, the downsides of Gemini tend to be that they do kind of want to be everywhere, everything, all at once. And the issue with that is they tend to be very scattered, very confused, lost. They might be people who, are kind of a jack of all trades but master of none. People who want to do everything all the time, but also realize that time in itself is finite, or that their ability to do things is finite, which can often drive them into madness, which we'll definitely talk about in the first decan of Gemini. However, another downside to Gemini is that they also have a hard time with decision making and choosing between 2 things, because like I said, they want to encapsulate everything. And that is a little bit of the downside of Mercury, especially as we compare it to Jupiter. Mercury is so, fascinated by the possibility of choice and the possibility that you can kind of put your hand into every single bucket, which sometimes can be really great and really fascinating, but other times, like I said, it can lead to madness or confusion or generally, paralysis, all of which can be found in the 3 different decans of Gemini, as well as the tarot card associations that are associated with Gemini and all the decans. Another thing about Gemini that people kind of tend to bristle at, or one of its downsides, is because it has the ability to be that shapeshifter or to contain a lot of multitudes at once. People can sometimes see that as fake, because I do feel like Gemini is, like I said, never made a stranger and has the ability to, be friendly to someone's worst enemy. Now, of course, you can accuse all the air signs of doing that. But Gemini, I think particularly, can really switch up their energy depending on the environment that they're in. That's kind of part of why they are the mutable air sign. And so they really do have that, brilliant capability of being able to be someone else depending on where they find themselves in, because they are truly an energy that contains multitudes. And because they also are ruled by Mercury, Mercury is so much about, duality, and it's all about, investigation and finding things and splitting and breaking and uncovering things, all that stuff. And Gemini really can excel at that. Another thing about Gemini that I will say, and especially in regards to association with Mercury, is that Gemini perfectly encapsulates curiosity. So basically, when you think about the order of the zodiac, you start with Aries, which is the initiator, the fire starter, cutting down a new path. And then you have Taurus, which is like, okay, now that we've blazed and cleared out a path, now this is where we have the meadow with which we can build and grow things for our future. And then now that you have that security, Gemini asks the question of okay, what is beyond what is secure? What is beyond these lands that we've cultivated in the era of Taurus? And now we're on the edge of exploration, and we are also, as what Austin Coppock calls, the birth of analysis. So I feel like that's very much encapsulated in the archetype of Gemini, is that this is when people or humans start to think and start to, discover what happens if I break this rule? That is also why Gemini is generally associated with the Lovers in the tarot associations. So in the card of the Lovers, it's depicted a man and a woman, and they have an angel kind of presiding or looking over them. Now, obviously, a lot of times when people pull the Lovers, they think that it refers to a romantic situation, and it oftentimes can. But usually, because of its association with Gemini, it also means choices, and the choice to do, good or evil. The choice of who your partner is going to be, or the choice of what job or career you're going to get into. And I feel like that's very much what encapsulates the energy of Gemini. And of course, this whole depiction that you see in the Lovers card is actually really referring to a story of Adam and Eve. And in the Garden of Eden, where Eve makes the choice, while she is tempted, she does eventually make the choice to eat, from the fruit of knowledge, and then also tempts Adam to eat from the fruit of knowledge, which, opens up their minds. And while that did have the benefits of them being able to, think about what they wanted for themselves and gave them the benefit of free will, it also gave them the downside of being, casted away from Eden and separated forever from God. So that is kind of the interesting nature of Gemini. And as I'll go through all of these decans, the main core theme that you will kind of see is that it really talks about the curse or the gift of knowledge. And what do you do with the curse or the gift of knowledge? And whether it's a curse or a gift ultimately does belong to you to decide that for yourself. Alright, let's talk about Gemini 1, which Austin Coppock calls the apple. Now this decan is ruled by Jupiter, which is interesting because, like I said, Jupiter does not really do that well in Mercury-ruled signs, which include Virgo and Gemini. So why is that? Now, Jupiter is often known as the planet of expansion. And while that's kind of true because it does rule over luck and abundance, Jupiter ultimately is sort of a ruler because it is sometimes represented by Zeus, which was, the king of the Greek gods. And so Jupiter's ultimate goal is to unite and to, coalesce and to bring things together. That is why you see, Jupiter rules over Pisces, which is the ocean. And it's yes, the ocean is tiny, made up of tiny little molecules of water, but at the end of the day, it is a united force around the globe. And so that is Jupiter's ultimate kind of purpose, is to bring things together. And through bringing things together, then Jupiter can also expand and subsequently multiply. However, Mercury is basically kind of the opposite. So if Jupiter rules over big things and expansion, and it is literally the gas giant, when you think about it. Mercury is the tiniest planet in our solar system, and Mercury rules over the minutiae, the details, like I said, the trivia, the small little facts that nobody remembers until it becomes relevant. That is all of Mercury's domain, and that is what Mercury is intimately interested in. And so Mercury is more about division. It's more about breaking things down into its essential parts. Now, Gemini is more focused about collecting as much data as possible, not through, necessarily sorting the data. And so I remember I was watching an astrology podcast episode, and Austin Coppock talked about how Gemini is more just spitting out knowledge, words, information, all that stuff, just kind of like blah, 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 right? While Virgo, which is also ruled and exalted, by Mercury, Virgo is more about editing that information that Gemini spits out. So Gemini is very much about, creation and analysis, and is not so much interested in kind of like, okay, how do we actually put this all together so that it makes sense? Gemini does not care about making sense. Gemini's energy is very much about like, okay, as I talk and talk and talk, maybe I'll come up with a thesis idea for this essay that I'm already in the midst of, discovering and talking about. And so it's really much about generation of knowledge and, splitting of knowledge and of truth than it really is about curating information and knowledge, which Virgo is more apt to do. Now, this is really important because when we talk about Gemini 1, other things that we kind of should mention is that it also is represented by the Eight of Swords in the tarot associations. Now, in the Eight of Swords, we can see presumably a woman who is blindfolded, and she is in the middle of a circle of swords. Now this card is very interesting because it's one of the cards that I feel like I see a lot of different interpretations about. And I also do have my own personal interpretation. Usually whenever I get this card, I always think about agency and whether you have it or not. When you see the Eight of Swords, you automatically think, okay, this is a woman or a person who does not have a lot of agency because she is effectively bound, she is trapped, and she also cannot see. However, when you look at the card further, you kind of notice like, wait, there's actually a gap in between the swords that she could theoretically walk out of. And like, because there are swords, if she were to fumble her way around, she theoretically could get out of her position, cut her bindings, take off her blindfold, walk away relatively easily. And so you start to kind of think like, is it actually her choice to maybe not explore, but to accept that she is in this bind instead of trying to, struggle and find a way out of that situation. And so that's very much when I think about this card, is that whenever I pull it or I pull it for other people, I'm thinking, okay, like this is a person who thinks that they don't have a lot of agency in this moment, or maybe sometimes it's like playing the victim. And maybe that is very true. Maybe that's very real. Maybe you don't have a lot of choices, but it's thinking about, okay, from the choices you do have, coming up with the best solution among those possibilities. That is all to say that we'll be talking about some very interesting movies that talk about this decan. So in this decan, because we do have that, Jupiter in Gemini, or Jupiter, answering to Mercury in this kind of form, like I said, this really does talk about the curse of knowing, the insanity of possibility, and it really refers to split attention, and it refers to like the binary, like, what happens when you start to be like, okay, 1 + 1 is 2 and 2 + 2 is 4 and yada 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 and so on and so forth. You know what I mean? Like, it just kind of starts to get away from you. And so in this, I decided to talk about the movie Twitches. So like I said, I'm going to be referring to movies that feature twins pretty prominently. And so of course we have the iconic twins, Tia and Tamara, featuring in the 2005 Disney Channel movie Twitches. Twitches is a 2005 Disney Channel original movie about twin sisters who learn that they are witches shortly after discovering the existence of one another. Together they must team up to stop an evil force called the Darkness that's invading their magical homeworld of Coventry. Now, I love this movie growing up. I also loved anything featuring Tia and Tamara because I feel like they're kind of like the black version of the Olsen twins, which I'll talk about later. So first I'll obviously talk about the spoiler free section and how it relates to the movie. So I really do feel like this movie perfectly encapsulates the duality. Start out with the birth of these two twins, which are originally named Apollo and Artemis, and they're born on Halloween night. That's why they have all this magic, yada yada yada. So we have Artemis, who after being birthed is later taken to Earth and split up from her twin sister Apollo. So Artemis is later renamed Alex, and she basically is like the, witch that represents night or the moon, because Artemis was the Greek goddess that represented the moon. So Alex is known for being reclusive and quiet, and she also tends to stay up all night as the moon rises, writing short stories or writing stories about magical twin sisters. Now we contrast that to Cameron. So Cameron is also Apollo. So when she was, split from birth or separated by birth from her twin sister, she was renamed into Cameron, but her original name is Apollo. So she is quite literally, depicted as the opposite to Alex. So Cameron is a lark, which is the opposite of a night owl, and she's a passionate artist who sketches realistic pictures of Coventry, which is their magical homeworld. She also wakes up early at sunrise, is generally spoiled and outgoing, has well-off parents, just generally, more of the happy-go-lucky sunshine one, to Alex's kind of like darker, brooding nature. So yeah, it's really interesting to kind of think about how both, Cameron and Alex are both artists, but they kind of do, or creatives, but they kind of do it in two different ways. So you have Cameron that does drawing and visual arts, and then you see Alex that is the writer and writes stories. And it's kind of interesting because they kind of are, like I said, two sides of like one coin, because they're both really, really skilled at their craft, and they both take it seriously, and also their craft is what leads them to discover that they actually have the gift of foresight or the gift of prophecy, because each of their crafts ends up foretelling a part of the prophecy that they are a part of. So that's really interesting. So now I'm going to talk about the spoiler section of this. If you haven't seen this movie, you're several years late, but I highly encourage you to watch it, especially as we move closer to fall, because it's a really cute movie. But I will be talking about the spoilers in this next section, so please skip ahead if you don't want this movie to be spoiled for you. So now, according to an old prophecy, the sisters are the only ones who are capable of vanquishing the darkness, aka the evil that is plaguing their home world of Coventry. Now, as Alex has the gift of knowledge, though I do believe that they both do, Alex refuses to help fulfill the prophecy because her stories end with death. And like I said, Alex is known for writing, stories or short stories about magical twin sisters, and all of them have kind of, I guess, a horrible or dark or gruesome ending. And since she knows that, she does not want to go through, helping, with this prophecy. She does not want it to come true. Now, Cameron manages to convince Alex to stay, assuring her that they are both unstoppable together, and the two practice their magical powers as they bond. Now, I feel like this really refers to the curse of knowledge once again, and how, despite that fear and anxiety and paralysis that comes with knowing, it is actually them using that Jupiter-Tarian concept or ability to merge and to coalesce is actually their biggest strength, while their biggest downfall is when they rely too much on that Mercury, in which they have the desire to scatter or to separate or to dissipate, and that is when they're at their weakest. And I think this movie really perfectly encapsulates that. While it's great to embrace the mercurial nature of wanting to divide things, wanting to go out to explore, to analyze, to figure out, to embrace your curiosity, too much of that can lead you to being paralyzed by your own fear. And so that is very important to really think about the way that you can embrace the Jupiter that is embraced by this decan, and the sense that you can really think about how you can still manage to merge and to coalesce disparate ideas into one. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about in the second decan of Gemini. Let's talk about the second decan of Gemini, which I call the non-binary. We often think of non-binary being not one or the other, but a secret third thing that rejects both. However, sometimes rejecting the binary happens through blending both sides of the spectrum together, choosing to be both and not either or. This is what Gemini 2 represents, how the two become one and the one can become two and so forth, splitting and merging in an infinite loop. And that is very much what is kind of expressed in this decan, very much how oftentimes like in a binary that it's not actually, you know, two warring sides like forever to be split, but often it is these things that are coming together and then splitting apart and then coming together and then splitting apart, and very much that is even the circle of life. Austin Coppock talks about how you are singular, you are dual. You fight, you nurture. You carry knives and arrows, you bring flowers and joy. You're a creature of love and strife, whole and entire. You are the one, the two united to create, their child. You are the one who gives birth to the two, their sole parent. Parent and child, masculine and feminine, yin and yang, the prima materia, and the final triumph of the great work. Now, I really totally love this description that Austin Coppock writes when he talks about this decan of Gemini. Now, this decan of Gemini is very interesting because it is ruled by a malefic. It is ruled by Mars. Now, Mars is represented by the tower in the tarot traditions. So this very much decan does kind of talk about the whole concept of, you know, love and war, and like strife and forgiveness, and very much that kind of like push-pull. Like originally I was gonna kind of name this decan Jekyll and Hyde because I feel like that is like a, you know, a great allegory to the whole idea of having, you know, both good and evil in like one person, and how those concepts, while they are very split, can often, you know, be joined in a way that can be very confusing and contradictory. However, I did think that I wanted to call this and talk about being non-binary, or just the whole concept of what non-binary is, and thinking about how so many artists, especially creative artists, have a lot of planets or placements in this decan and really encapsulate what it is to blend a lot of things together and to refuse to be caught in the middle or even forced to choose between one and the other, because they simply are not that. Like, I feel like a really good example is, you know, the artist formerly known as Prince. He has a lot of decans in this Gemini, and if you look at his entire career, it very much was about rejecting being put into one singular category, which I totally love. Now, if we get more into the tarot associations, this decan is represented by the Nine of Swords, which is also named the Lord of Cruelty. So in the Nine of Swords, you can see a person, presumably a woman, sitting up in bed, holding her head and appearing to be crying or sobbing or in some type of like anguish, especially of a mental kind of variety. So whenever I think of this, especially since this scene is depicted at night, or that she's woken up out of her sleep, I always think of like night terrors or like nightmares. And this card is often represented as anxiety or mental anguish or tremendous stress. And often when you pull this card, it's easy to kind of be like, oh, this is something that's happening all in my head. But when we kind of really think about it, it's kind of like, you know, even if the actual manifestation of your fear isn't actually real or isn't actually going to come to fruition, the anxiety and the fear and the stress that you were experiencing is real. And that is something that you have to deal with, and you have to conquer, and that you have to embrace, that you have to eventually work through, so that you can have a harmonious, happy life. One thing that I love that T. Susan Chang mentions in her blog post, at the end of her talking about this decan of Gemini, she mentions how her husband, you know, has this saying, and it's basically like, if you can do something about it, why worry? If you can't do anything about it, why worry? This is something that my mom always says to me. Like whenever I call on the phone and I'm like, oh, I'm so stressed about this, or I'm really worried about this, her whole thing is like, okay, well, if you could do something about it, then why are you stressed about it? You have power, you have the ability to change your situation. But then if I can't do anything about it, also why worry? You have no power, you have no ability to change your situation. And at the end of the day, while those seem like very, different or equally terrifying concepts, you kind of have to realize that it actually is the same side of the coin. You either are subject to your own free will or your own sense of fate. And at the end of the day, whatever happens, happens. And it's up to you to kind of accept that outcome without the unnecessary, anguish of your own stress added on top of that. All right, that is why I chose to talk about New York Minute, which features the Olsen twins. Now, when I was originally thinking about doing this series on the decans, especially about Gemini, I knew that I wanted to do twin movies. So I knew, of course, the Olsen twins are going to pop up. So if you don't know the Olsen twins, they started out as like child actors, and now they've kind of disappeared into obscurity, probably for the best, to be honest. But they did have a lot of, string of films when they were, in their, preteen to teenage to, I guess, young adult years. From about, I guess, like the 90s until the early 2000s, where they basically often play sisters, going through in different settings and different places, going through different types of struggles. So they even have a movie where they go to Paris, where they go to Rome, where they're in London, where they're like, on a reality, TV show. Like they have all these different types of films, and they usually just kind of play sisters. And a lot of the biggest trope of all these movies is that they play sisters that have usually some sort of strife or some sort of difference kind of between them. Like, you have like the fun-loving sister, and then you have like the grumpy sister, or you have, sister who's sporty and the one who's into fashion. Like, you know what I mean? Like they usually kind of play up that whole like duality or binary of the twins like a lot. So it's really interesting to kind of see. That is why I chose to talk about 2004's New York Minute. So in New York Minute, twin sisters Jane and Roxy, played by the Olsen twins, spend a chaotic day in New York City while they simultaneously attempt to chase their dreams and escape trouble. So I'm probably not going to talk a lot about any spoilers related to this film, but because the film is pretty like, lighthearted, campy, silly, goofy, great for children. I remember eating up and absolutely loving every second of the Olsen twins whenever I watched them, as a preteen, because I was like, oh my god, that's gonna be me when I'm older. No, but a girl could dream. So let's talk about what this movie kind of, references and how it relates to the decan of Gemini 2. So a core theme of this decan is the emphasis of opposites. In many of the Olsen twin films of this era, the sisters usually play characters that are foils of each other. So in this one, we have Jane. So Jane is studious and uptight, depicted as a caretaker that needs control, while Roxy is adventurous, outgoing, and generally irreverent of all rules or social conventions. So the two often clash, as Jane sees Roxy as someone who never takes anything seriously, while Roxy sees Jane as someone who never loosens up or tends to give up control. So like I said, there's that tension or that clash, which I feel like is really represented by the fact that this decan is ruled by Mars. Like I said, once again, the anguish that's brought on by Mars is very real. Like when you pull the Tower card, which also represents Mars, you do experience that fear or that change of like the lightning bolt that's going to split apart and crash and cause your entire world to crumble. That is very much, I feel like, the tension that is often you see in the twins of Gemini. So it's really interesting because at the end of the day, their mutual success does kind of come together as the two learn to work together. Really just like, this film really shows how you kind of both need, Roxy's rebelliousness and boldness, as well as Jane's sense of structure and order, and her ability to take things seriously does help them in times. And so you very much kind of need that like merging together while also when they split apart, they're also able to help each other. And I feel like that is kind of the beauty of duality, or beauty of the twins. I also feel like this movie really does kind of really encapsulate the whole idea of both and in the sense that, like, you know, this movie doesn't try to kind of say, oh, you know, Jane is better than Roxy, or Roxy is better than Jane, or one goal is better than the other because Jane is trying to, you know, get a scholarship while Roxy is trying to get like a record deal. You know, they don't like try to, like, you know, necessarily pit that to those two goals of those two ideologies against each other, but rather kind of say like those two goals and ideologies kind of work together when they kind of utilizes each other's, like, you know, strengths to fight against each other's weaknesses. And then I feel like that's a very important concept when you think about this decan, and also the concept of the non-binary. That it doesn't have to be, you know, man versus woman, masc versus femme, you know, anything that you want to say, and that it's really about these two energies like working together to be in harmony. All right, let's talk about Gemini 3, the Executioner's Sword. Now, this decan is ruled by the sun, which the sun is just represented by the Sun tarot card, which I think is kind of funny because, you know, the moon is not represented by the moon tarot card. So I think it's nice that the sun, they were like, let's just be like actually literal with this. So Gemini 3, the Executioner's Sword. So this is a very interesting card because while it is ruled by the sun, and, you know, the sun has all its brilliance, all its glory, all its power, you know, all that stuff, right? You also have that contrasted by the fact that this decan also represents or is depicted by the Ten of Swords. Now, the Ten of Swords is a pretty gnarly card. It's one of those cards that I'd put in the, oh my god, I really hope I don't get this category. Now, of course, you know, the Ten of Swords energy is ultimately unavoidable. You know, we can't avoid endings, we can't avoid being overwhelmed, we can't even avoid death. And so while it may be stressful to get the Ten of Swords, it is kind of important to recognize that this energy in our life is ultimately inevitable. So the Ten of Swords is also known as the Lord of Ruin. In it, you can see, you know, presumably a man depicted as being very dead on the floor with 10 swords in his back. However, in the back, you can see the sunrise slowly creeping up over the horizon, which is really funny because, like I said, this decan is also ruled by the sun. And so whenever I get this card, as while it is the finality of death and of endings, and maybe it is the culmination of that anxiety and that fear that you were seeing in the Nine of Swords, and maybe all that stuff that Mars kind of, you know, predicted does eventually kind of come through in the Ten of Swords. It is also about, you know, once again, like rebirth and beginning anew, especially since this decan, you know, is the last decan of Gemini, and after Gemini we have Cancer. Now, Cancer is the start of the summer solstice. So whenever the sun moves into Cancer, that is when we officially have the summer solstice. Now, while the summer solstice is generally a joyous time of year because that is when, at least in the northern hemisphere, we have the greatest hours of daylight, it also means that after this point, the sun and the amount of sunlight that we have throughout the year will constantly be decreasing until we have the winter solstice, which will be the start of Capricorn season, Cancer's opposite. So that is really interesting because this decan, while it is called the Executioner's Sword for a reason, it's because this is when, you know, the desperate warring natures of the twins that we talked about in, you know, Gemini 2, now we have to make that choice of who lives and who dies, because this represents the allegory or the stories that we find in a lot of twin narratives where one twin unfortunately reaches its demise. So in this, you see Cain and Abel, but you also see Castor and Pollux. And Castor and Pollux is actually the where we get the myth of Gemini in and of itself. So basically in this, Castor and Pollux are twins. However, since I think they share a mother, but they have separate fathers. So Pollux is actually a demigod because his father is a god. And you have Castor, who is actually entirely immortal. And so because you have the mortal Castor and the immortal Pollux, you kind of have that warring nature, which I talked about already, which is kind of like what happens when Castor does eventually die, which happens after they have their great many adventure. Castor is killed, and Pollux, mourning his death, asks the gods if he can share his immortality with his twin brother. So basically what happens is they end up sharing, that immortality, which means that they, spend part of their time in the underworld, but they also spend part of their time in the heavens, which eventually leads them to having, the constellation of Gemini in the sky, which is represented by the two of them. Well, I think this story is really, really sweet, and it does kind of, once again encapsulate the whole idea of that things that are split most always kind of come together again, and that while the nature of being split and of being separate, of being dual is great and all, eventually something must become one again, must return back to the earth, which often people talk about when they refer to death. And so there's also other allegories that talk about this whole idea of the Ten of Swords and the sun. And basically that the Ten of Swords also represents the sun itself being killed via the, summer solstice, which, like I said, does lead to decreasing daylight. In one myth, we have the sacrifice of the sun as the Lord of Light is killed and his brother in darkness takes over, aka the summer solstice, a death that reduces a warring pair into a stable unity. And so, like I said, once again, that whole idea of, that the summer solstice, aka the start of Cancer season, is the sun's last hurrah, because now it is decreasing in power, it is decreasing in light, and we are now increasing in darkness. And, the Lord of Darkness is now taking over. And so that's very much kind of encapsulated in this whole idea of this decan, because this decan really does represent hard choices. It represents the fact that we must come to a conclusion, we must come to a judgment. And as scary as that is, ultimately that unity is what makes life possible. Austin Coppock, when he talked about this decan, he talks about how there are always more possibilities than actualities, as the actual is a subset of the possibilities. Which means what actually manifests from infinite possibilities can be found in this decan. Who is actually born? When life is created, millions of sperm, travel towards the egg. However, only one sperm can fertilize the eggs. And while all these millions of sperm that are, racing towards the egg kind of symbolize all the different manifestations of life, or all the different combinations of genetics that could produce a person, only one will win out, and only one person can actually be born. And I feel like that kind of very much represents this whole idea behind this decan. So that's why I decided to talk about Glass Onion, a Knives Out mystery. Now, Glass Onion is a 2022 mystery film in which a detective, Benoit Blanc, goes to a private island to investigate a billionaire and his posse. Now I'm just going to talk about, obviously, the spoiler-free version first, but I do really highly encourage you to eventually watch this movie, because to really understand how this does relate to the third decan of Gemini, that will need me to explain some spoilers, but spoiler-free first. So, death is a central theme of this decan, as it is represented by the Ten of Swords, a brutal ending. And the film does an excellent job of, subverting a lot of tropes, including the murder mystery, because ultimately, it being a Knives Out film, murder mystery, or the whodunit, is going to be a central, plot of this entire thing and this entire film. Unfortunately, that's kind of all I can say before I get too much into the spoiler version. But yeah, I highly encourage you to watch this film, and after you watch it, it's on Netflix. After you watch it, I, encourage you to come back to this video and watch the end so you can truly figure out how this relates to the decan of Gemini 3. Now, in terms of spoilers, in the final act of the film, we are taken through an extensive flashback that reveals that Andy has actually been dead all along, and the person posing as her is actually Helen, Andy's twin sister. As soon as Helen discovered Andy's demise, she hired the detective Blanc to help her investigate. Unfortunately, it is here where we see the greatest representation of this decan, the death of a twin, and how one twin you know, is forced to avenge the other. Similar to Castor and Pollux, where Pollux, you know, makes it his mission to kind of, you know, revive Castor through sharing his immortality with him. So Helen is determined to not only avenge Andy's death, but also to ensure her legacy remains untarnished. I feel like that is especially kind of true when you consider that Helen's entire goal is to find the napkin that Andy wrote her, you know, her notes or her vision of the company that Miles, you know, eventually, you know, created, aka stole from her, and to very much ensure that no, you know, Helen really wanted the world to know that no, Andy was not crazy. Andy, you know, was ambitious, she was driven, she was a visionary, but she ultimately, you know, had her intellectual property taken from her, and that is an injustice that Helen desperately sought to make you know, right, because she knew that she couldn't, unlike Pollux, revive her sister, but she could at least ensure that her sister's legacy remained unblemished, while of course tarnishing Miles's legacy. And I feel like that's also even more kind of seen when you think about the whole, like I said, the whole myth of Gemini, where the reason why they are constellation in the sky is because of Pollux and his sacrifice, you know, for his brother, and the whole idea of being immortalized in the sky or in the stars forever is really beautiful. Beyond that, we also kind of see in Glass Onion how you know, the death of one twin was unfortunately a sacrifice that needed to happen in order for Miles to kind of eventually be taken down. And it's all like, you know, would Andy have ever been truly successful in, you know, taking down Miles's empire, or through exposing his idiocy to the entire world, if she had not unfortunately been killed by him? Probably not. And so it kind of shows that whole theme about needing to, you know, have that sacrifice or that demise or that decay of one twin so you can kind of eventually have the whole. And in this, Helen throughout this movie really actually kind of embraces Gemini 2 as well, where she has to embrace the duality or the non-binariness of being both herself, Helen, but also having to slip into the role of Andy, you know, and embrace that power of being Andy, someone who is known as, you know, elusive, but also intimidating by the others. And it's because the others are aware that Andy, you know, has all the power, and Andy is actually the brains behind this entire operation. And so I really do kind of love how I feel like this movie, Glass Onion, really is the perfect fitting end to when you really want to think about, you know, Gemini as a whole, which is represented by the twins. And in this film, while the twins serves as like a plot twist that you didn't really see coming, I think that it also really does kind of encapsulate the whole energy between, okay, like, you know, we are two beings who sometimes have to come together to be one to ultimately get the ultimate goal, which is peace and harmony and justice. So I really hope you enjoyed this explanation of Glass Onion. I also really hope that you enjoyed this explanation of all the films that I just talked about. Thank you so much for watching. I will say that I do have some services that I am currently offering. So right now I am offering two main services. That is my astrology services and then also my digital marketing services. So for the astrology services, I offer astrology readings over Zoom. So if you're very interested to kind of know more about your chart, and especially more about your life and your life events and the people in your life, and exploring all of that, I highly encourage you to book a chart reading with me, because I am a fabulous, excellent astrologer, if I do say so myself. Now, if you aren't necessarily in need of an astrology reading, which I'm very surprised about, I do encourage you to also book with my digital marketing services. Now, this is an option where I basically will talk about how to do brand strategy, how to do email marketing, how to do social media marketing, and basically to do anything that will get your business more attention and to get your business not only more views and engagement online, but also more sales, and how to convert more people into real lifelong lasting clients. And so if you're interested with that, all of that information will be in the bio, linked below. But thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you, if you love it, that you like, comment, and subscribe. And please let me know in the comments if you have any other twin movies that you think that I should check out, or if you have any movies that you think that encapsulate Gemini season as a whole. Final thing that I will shout out is thank you so much to this Mercury shirt that I have. I got it from Norwalk. I also will be posting a vlog to Norwalk hopefully in the coming weeks for any astrologers who are interested in like what the conference is like. But I got this shirt from it and I really thought, oh, this is very appropriate of Gemini since you're talking about Mercury. This shirt also says as above, so below, which is a common quote that a lot of astrologers like to reference or talk about because it is associated with Mercury as well as the tarot card, the Magician, and also basically kind of conceptualizes how we think about astrology as a whole, which is basically as the heavens move above us, all that motion and representation is also represented by the stuff that's going down below on Earth. So I will definitely link the guy who made this shirt. It's a tank top as well. Whoever made this shirt, I will definitely put that somewhere here and also put a link to his shop below. But yeah, thank you so much for checking out this video and I hope to talk to you next time. Bye bye.